January 17th, 1942, North Atlantic, 03:47 hours. The ice clung to the railings of U-boat 568 like frozen tears. Kapitän Lieutenant Joachim Preuss stood in the conning tower, the salt spray crystallizing on his beard as the diesel engines rumbled beneath his boots. Around him the black water heaved and rolled, endless and indifferent. In his hand he clutched a decoded message from U-boat command, coordinates, timing, rendezvous points. The paper was damp, but the typed letters were clear, absolute, sacred. He believed, as every commander in the Kriegsmarine believed, that these words were born in secrecy and would die in secrecy, that the enemy could not touch them, that German engineering, German precision had made them invincible. In 4 hours, his wolf pack would converge on Convoy HX-172. They would strike before dawn. They would vanish before the escorts could respond. This was the promise of the Enigma machine. This was the doctrine of the invisible war. But 3,000 miles to the west, in a cold brick building on the outskirts of Washington, a young woman named Ruth held the same message. She had read it 6 hours before Preuss received it. She had typed it onto a card, indexed it, and passed it to a naval intelligence officer who would route it to convoy commanders in the Atlantic. Ruth did not speak German. She did not know what a U-boat looked like up close. But she knew numbers, she knew patterns, and she knew that Kapitän Lieutenant Joachim Preuss, at this very moment, was steering toward an ambush he could not imagine. The Germans never knew. Not in 1942, not in 1943. Not even in 1945, when the war ended and their cities were ash. They never knew that their most sacred cipher, their Enigma machine, had been broken. That every convoy coordinate, every patrol route, every rendezvous, every whisper in the dark had been read, catalogued, and countered by an enemy they believed was blind. The Enigma machine was born in the aftermath of the First World War, in a Germany humiliated by defeat and starved by blockade. It was a child of paranoia and genius, a mechanical marvel that promised to make German communications unreadable to any adversary. The device itself was deceptively simple, a typewriter connected to a series of rotors and plug boards that scrambled each letter into a cipher so complex that the number of possible settings exceeded 10, followed by 23 zeros. To the German High Command, it was mathematics made manifest. It was proof that the mind of the Reich could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the minds of its enemies. By 1939, every branch of the German military, Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, relied on Enigma for operational communication. Commanders typed their orders into the machine, and the message emerged as gibberish. Only another Enigma machine, set to the exact rotor positions and plugboard settings, could reverse the process. And those settings changed daily. At midnight, across every base and every ship and every front, German radiomen would consult their code books and reset their machines. The enemy, German intelligence assured its commanders, would need centuries to break a single day's traffic. But what the Germans did not know, what they could not conceive, was that their enemy had already begun, not with brute force, but with patience, not with soldiers, but with mathematicians. In 1932, Polish cryptanalysts at the Bureau Cyfrow in Warsaw had obtained an Enigma machine through espionage. For 7 years, they studied it in secret, building mechanical devices called bombs to test rotor settings at inhuman speed. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Polish codebreakers fled to France, carrying their research with them. Weeks before the fall of Paris, they passed their work to British intelligence. The British took it to a Victorian mansion 50 miles north of London, a place called Bletchley Park. There, in a landscape of gardens and huts and secrecy, the war's most invisible battle would be fought. The men and women who gathered at Bletchley Park were not soldiers. They were linguists, chess champions, classicists, engineers. They were people who saw the world as puzzles, as systems that could be understood if only you stared long enough. Alan Turing, a mathematician with a stutter and a fondness for long bicycle rides, became the soul of the operation. He refined the Polish bombs into something faster, something relentless. Machines that could test thousands of rotor positions per hour, hunting for patterns in the chaos. But the machines alone were not enough. Enigma's settings changed daily. Its operators made errors, small human errors, that the British learned to exploit. A lazy radio man who used the same three-letter greeting. A naval officer who began every weather report with the word weather. These were the cracks. These were the places where mathematics met humanity, and humanity lost. By mid-1941, Bletchley Park was reading German naval traffic almost in real time. The intelligence product was codenamed Ultra, and its existence was the most closely guarded secret of the war. Winston Churchill called it his secret weapon. Dwight Eisenhower would later say it shortened the war by 2 years. But to keep the secret, the Allies had to do something monstrous. They had to let men die. If every intercepted U-boat coordinate led to an immediate counterattack, the Germans would realize their cipher was broken. They would change it. They would build something new, something the Allies might never crack. And so the British and Americans adopted a doctrine of calculated loss. They would act on ultra-intelligence only when they could plausibly explain it through other means: aerial reconnaissance, direction finding, captured prisoners. Convoys were rerouted just enough to avoid wolf packs, but not so precisely that it seemed supernatural. Ships still sank, men still drowned, but fewer than would have without the secret. The German submariners never suspected. They believed in their machine the way monks believe in Scripture. When convoys evaded them, they attributed it to luck, to weather, to the incompetence of their own reconnaissance. When U-boats vanished without a trace, they assumed it was mines or depth charges or the cruel randomness of the sea. The idea that their encrypted orders were being read before they even received them, this was beyond imagination. The Enigma machine was German science, German engineering. It was supposed to be perfect. Oberleutnant Dietrich Hoffmann had believed in perfection once. In the summer of 1940, when France fell and Britain stood alone, he had stood on the deck of U-203 and watched the sun set over the Bay of Biscay, and he had felt invincible. The Enigma machine sat below deck, bolted to a steel table, its rotors gleaming under the electric light. Every evening the radioman would decode the day's orders, and every evening Hoffmann would read them aloud to his officers. They were always precise, always certain, coordinates down to the minute, timing down to the hour. The British, Hoffmann was told, were sailing blind. Their convoys wandered the Atlantic like sheep, and the U-boats were wolves. This was the promise. But by 1942, the sea had changed. Convoys that should have been easy prey altered course hours before the attack. Rendezvous points that should have been safe were suddenly swarming with destroyers. Hoffmann's boat returned to port again and again with torpedoes unexpended, with nothing to report but empty ocean. Other boats did not return at all. In the officers' mess in Lorient, men drank and argued and theorized. Perhaps the British had developed new radar. Perhaps they had spies in the ports. Perhaps the meteorologists were providing faulty forecasts. But never, never did anyone suggest that the Enigma machine itself had been compromised. To suggest such a thing would have been treason or madness. In November 1943, U-203 was sunk by depth charges south of Iceland. Hoffmann survived. He spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Canada, where he taught himself English by reading American newspapers. The papers spoke of Allied victories, of German defeats, but never of how those victories were won. When the war ended, Hoffmann returned to Hamburg and became a school teacher. He never learned that the orders he had trusted, the coordinates he had followed, had been read by the enemy before he ever saw them. He died in 1981, believing that the Enigma machine had kept its promise. The men and women of Bletchley Park worked in silence. They signed the Official Secrets Act and were told that to speak of their work, even to their families, would be a criminal offense. Most of them did not know what the other huts were doing. A translator in Hut 4 might spend her days decoding German weather reports, never knowing that her work fed into the convoy routing decisions being made. In Hut 8, a bomb operator in Hut 11 might watch the rotors spin for hours, never knowing that her machine had just located a U-boat wolf pack that would be destroyed the following day. The work was tedious. The work was exhausting. Shifts ran 12 hours. The huts were cold in winter and stifling in summer. Many of the workers were women, thousands of them, recruited from universities and finishing schools, trained in secrecy, and told nothing except what they needed to know. Joan Clark was one of them. A mathematician from Cambridge, she worked alongside Alan Turing in Hut 8, breaking naval Enigma ciphers. She was brilliant, faster than most of the men, and yet she was paid less because the civil service classified her as a linguist rather than a cryptanalyst. She did not complain. None of them did. Complaint was a luxury. The war was not a luxury. Every day the teleprinters clattered with intercepted German transmissions. Every day the bombs hummed and clicked, testing rotor settings. Every day the decoded messages passed through Clark's hands and became orders, intelligence, death. In Washington, the Americans had built their own operation. The Navy's code-breaking unit, OP-20G, worked in parallel with Bletchley Park, sharing intelligence and techniques. The Americans had their own bombs, their own linguists, their own silent army of clerks and analysts. Ruth, the woman who had read Captain Lieutenant Preuss's message before he did, was one of thousands. She had been a secretary in Maryland before the war. She had never thought about cryptography, never thought about submarines. But the Navy had tested her, found her mind quick and her discretion absolute, and now she sat in a windowless room sorting punch cards that represented the death or survival of men she would never meet. She did this for 3 years. She never told her husband what she did. When he asked, she said she filed papers for the Admiralty. It was not entirely a lie. The symbolic object of this secret war was not a weapon. It was paper, thin, flimsy, bureaucratic paper. Every decoded Enigma message was typed onto a sheet, stamped with a security classification, and filed. Thousands of messages, tens of thousands. By 1944, the filing system at Bletchley Park occupied entire buildings. Librarians, most of them women, indexed every decrypt by date, by sender, by subject. If an intelligence officer needed to know the fuel capacity of a specific U-boat, he could request the file and have it within minutes. If a convoy commander needed to know the last reported position of a German surface raider, the information was there, cross-referenced and waiting. The Germans, meanwhile, still believed their messages vanished into the ether. They did not know that their words had become a library, that their secrets had been cataloged like specimens in a museum. Paper was the weapon, paper was the memory, and paper, in the end, was the evidence that would never be destroyed. After the war, the British government ordered most of the Bletchley Park files burned. Thousands of pages of decrypts, logs, and reports were incinerated to preserve the secret, but not all of them. Some were kept, hidden in archives, classified for decades. It was not until the 1970s that the story of Ultra began to emerge. A historian named F.W. Winterbotham published a book called The Ultra Secret, and suddenly the world learned what the Codebreakers had done. Veterans who had kept silent for 30 years were finally allowed to speak. Alan Turing, who had died in 1954 under circumstances both tragic and unjust, was posthumously recognized as a hero. The women of Bletchley Park, so many of them forgotten, their contributions erased by classification and sexism, began to be remembered. but the Germans even then struggled to believe it. In the 1970s, surviving U-boat commanders were interviewed by historians. They were told that their Enigma messages had been read throughout the war. Many of them refused to accept it. They insisted it was impossible. The mathematics, they said, did not allow it. The security protocols, they said, were too rigorous. Some believed it was Allied propaganda, a post-war myth designed to diminish the skill and bravery of the Kriegsmarine. Others simply could not reconcile the idea that their trust, their faith in the machine, had been misplaced. To admit that Enigma had been broken was to admit that they had fought the entire war in the light, believing themselves hidden in shadow. The emotional weight of this revelation cannot be understated. Imagine being Kapitän-Leutnant Joachim Preuss, had he survived. Imagine learning, decades after the war, that every order you received had been read by the enemy, that the coordinates you plotted, the rendezvous points you trusted, the patrol routes you followed, all of it had been known, that the men you lost, the ships you failed to sink, the nights you spent freezing in the Atlantic, all of it might have been different, that your courage, your skill, your loyalty had been rendered meaningless by a secret you never suspected. This is not a comfortable truth. This is not a truth that fits neatly into the narratives of honor and sacrifice that veterans tell themselves to survive. The Americans and British who worked on Ultra carried a different weight. They knew they had saved lives. They knew they had shortened the war, but they also knew they had read the mail of men who believed themselves secure. They had eavesdropped on fear, on hope, on the mundane bureaucracy of killing. A decoded message might contain coordinates for a convoy attack. It might also contain a radio man's joke, a commander's complaint about rations, a mention of a wife's letter received. The Codebreakers did not think of these men as human. They could not afford to. If they had, the work would have been unbearable. And so they trained themselves to see the messages as data, as problems to be solved. The humanity was edited out, the same way the Germans edited out the humanity of the convoys they hunted. But the humanity remained on both sides, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The German radio man who made the same careless mistake every morning, beginning his message with the same three-letter sequence, was not a fool. He was tired. He was cold. He was a 19-year-old kid from Bavaria who wanted to go home. The British clerk who spotted that pattern and logged it for the Codebreakers was not cruel. She was doing her job. She was trying to end the war. Neither of them ever met. Neither of them knew the other existed. But their lives were entangled, knotted together by the invisible thread of encrypted text. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned. The Allies were sinking U-boats faster than Germany could replace them. Convoys crossed the ocean with losses measured in single digits, sometimes in zero. The wolf packs that had once terrorized the shipping lanes were scattered, hunted, destroyed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, could not understand it. He demanded investigations. He ordered changes to Enigma procedures, adding a fourth rotor to the naval machines to increase complexity. The British Codebreakers adapted. It took them months, but they adapted. The paper kept coming. The messages kept being read. Dönitz believed until the end of his life that the Enigma machine was never truly broken. In his memoirs, published in 1958, he acknowledged that the Allies had possessed extraordinary intelligence, but he attributed it to radar, to direction-finding technology, to espionage. He could not accept the alternative. To accept it would have been to accept that the entire strategic foundation of the U-boat campaign had been built on sand, that every decision he made, every order he gave, had been compromised, that his men had died not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy could read his mind. The tragedy of the Enigma machine is not that it was broken. The tragedy is that it was trusted. The Germans built a system so complex, so mathematically elegant, that they convinced themselves it was unbreakable. They ignored warning signs, They dismissed anomalies. They punished anyone who suggested that security might be compromised. This was not stupidity. This was hubris. The same hubris that led them to believe they could conquer Europe, could dominate the seas, could bend the world to their ideology. The Enigma machine was a mirror. It reflected the culture that created it, brilliant, meticulous, and fatally overconfident. The Allies, meanwhile, demonstrated a different kind of strength. Not the strength of invincibility, but the strength of humility. They knew their codes could be broken, so they changed them constantly. They knew their enemy was clever, so they assumed nothing. They built systems of redundancy, of verification, of doubt. And when they captured an intact Enigma machine from a sinking U-boat in 1941, they did not celebrate publicly. They did not boast. They buried the achievement under layers of classification and misdirection because they understood that the greatest weapon is the weapon your enemy does not know exists. There is a photograph taken at Bletchley Park in 1945 of the Codebreakers celebrating the end of the war. They are gathered outside one of the huts, men and women in uniform and civilian clothes, smiling, arms around each other. Some of them are holding bottles of beer. Some of them are crying. In the center of the photograph, barely visible, is a stack of papers on a wooden table. The papers are covered in typed text, decoded German messages. They are the last Enigma decrypts of the war. Within days, they will be burned. The people in the photograph know this. They know that their work, their contribution, will be erased, that they will go home and never speak of it. That history will remember the generals and the soldiers, but not the clerks and the mathematicians. They are smiling anyway. This is the paradox of secret victories. The people who achieve them must live without recognition. They must watch the world celebrate others while they remain silent. For the Codebreakers of Bletchley Park and OP-20G, this silence lasted decades. Some of them died without ever being thanked. Some of them lived long enough to see their story told, but only in fragments, only with pieces still missing. The full archive of ultra-decrypts remains partially classified even today. There are still secrets within secrets, messages that will never be read by anyone outside the intelligence community. The Germans, too, carried silence. But theirs was a silence of ignorance, not secrecy. They did not know what had been done to them. They fought the war believing in a certainty that did not exist. And when the war ended, they searched for explanations, for reasons why they had lost, why their strategies had failed, why the enemy had always seemed one step ahead. They invented theories. They blamed individuals. They blamed technology. But they did not blame the Enigma machine, because to blame the machine would have been to acknowledge that their entire understanding of the war was incomplete. In the North Atlantic, the sea does not remember. The wrecks of U-boats rest on the ocean floor, their hulls corroded, their crews long gone. Inside some of those wrecks, encased in silt and rust, are Enigma machines. Archaeologists have recovered a few of them, brought them to the surface, placed them in museums. They are beautiful objects, even in decay. The rotors still turn, the keys still press. But they are silent now. They will never again encode a message. They will never again promise security. They are relics of a faith that was misplaced, of a trust that was betrayed by mathematics and patience. The convoys, meanwhile, delivered their cargo, millions of tons of fuel, food, weapons, vehicles, the material that sustained Britain, that armed the Soviet Union, that made the invasion of Europe possible. The convoys crossed the Atlantic because the Allies could read the positions of the U-boats hunting them. The convoys crossed because young women in England and America sat in cold rooms and broke ciphers. The convoys crossed because Alan Turing built a machine that could think faster than a human mind. The convoys crossed because the Germans never knew. This is the larger truth that the Enigma story reveals, that wars are not won only by courage or firepower, they are won by information, by the ability to see what the enemy cannot see, to know what the enemy does not know. The soldiers who stormed the beaches, the pilots who flew the missions, the sailors who manned the guns, they were brave. But their bravery was made possible by people who never wore uniforms, who never fired shots, who never received medals. The invisible army, the army of paper and numbers and silence. After the war, the British and Americans did not dismantle their code-breaking operations. They expanded them. The lessons of Ultra were too valuable to forget. The infrastructure, the techniques, the culture of secrecy, all of it was preserved and refined. Bletchley Park became the model for modern signals intelligence. The bomb machines evolved into the first electronic computers. The clerks and analysts who had sorted Enigma decrypts became the founders of agencies like GCHQ and NSA. The war had proven that information was power, and the victors were not about to relinquish that power. The Germans, meanwhile, were forbidden from rebuilding their military intelligence apparatus, but they studied what had happened. As the ultra-secret slowly leaked out over the decades, German historians and engineers began to analyze how Enigma had been broken. They wrote papers, they built simulations, they tried to understand where the system had failed, and what they found was both humbling and instructive. Enigma had not failed because of a single flaw. It had failed because of many small flaws compounded over time, operator errors, procedural laziness, predictable message formats. The machine itself was sound, but the machine was used by humans, and humans are never as perfect as mathematics. This, too, is a lesson worth remembering. That technology alone does not guarantee security, that the strongest encryption is useless if the person using it is careless. That secrecy is not a product you can purchase. It is a discipline you must practice. The Germans learned this lesson too late. The Allies learned it in time. Today, the Enigma machine is a symbol. Museums display it as an artifact of a bygone era, a curiosity from a time when encryption was mechanical rather than digital. Tourists photograph it. Children press the keys. But the machine's legacy is not historical. It is contemporary. Every time you send an encrypted message on your phone, every time you log into a secure website, every time a government agency intercepts a communication, you are living in the world that Enigma created. The world where information is the most valuable resource, where the ability to hide a message or to break a message can determine the fate of nations. The Germans never knew. This is the sentence that haunts the story. They fought with skill. They fought with courage. They fought with technology they believed was unbreakable. And they never knew that their enemy was reading their mail, that every plan, every movement, every secret was an open book. They never knew, and so they could never adapt. They could never change. They could never win. The Codebreakers knew. And they carried that knowledge in silence, a weight measured not in pounds, but in lives. The lives saved by a decoded message. The lives lost because acting on that message would have revealed the secret. The lives lived afterward, in the shadow of something that could never be spoken. This is the burden of the invisible war. That the victories are hidden, that the heroes are anonymous, that the truth is locked away, sometimes for decades, sometimes forever. There is a gravestone in a cemetery in Flensburg, Germany. It belongs to a radioman named Hans Kessler, who served aboard U-515 and died when his boat was sunk in 1943. The stone is simple. It lists his name, his rank, his dates of birth and death. It does not say that the message he transmitted on the morning of April 9, 1943, was intercepted by a listening station in Scotland, relayed to Bletchley Park, decrypted by a bomb machine in Hut 11, and passed to a destroyer group that hunted his U-boat for 6 hours before sinking it with depth charges. It does not say that his last words, encoded by an Enigma machine, were read by the enemy before his commander saw them. It does not say that he died trusting a system that had already betrayed him. Hans Kessler did not know. None of them knew. And in their ignorance, they were defeated. This is the final reflection. That the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest campaign of World War II, was decided not by torpedoes or depth charges, but by patience and mathematics, by people who could see patterns in chaos, by people who understood that the enemy's greatest weakness was their certainty. The Germans believed in the Enigma machine the way a priest believes in God, absolutely, without question, without room for doubt. And that belief made them vulnerable, because faith, when misplaced, is not strength. It is blindness. The Allies did not have faith. They had doubt. They had systems of verification, of testing, of constant improvement. They assumed their codes could be broken, so they built new ones. They assumed their enemy was listening, so they spoke carefully. They assumed nothing was certain, so they prepared for everything. And in that preparation, in that humility, they found the edge they needed to win. The sea does not remember, but we do. We remember the convoys that made it across. We remember the U-boats that did not return. We remember the men and women who sat in cold rooms and broke unbreakable codes. We remember the Germans who never knew, and the Allies who never told. We remember that wars are fought not only in the light, but in shadow, not only with guns, but with minds, and that the greatest victories are the ones the enemy never sees coming. The Enigma machine sits in a museum now, behind glass, silent. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the click of the rotors, the hum of the bombs, the whisper of paper passing from hand to hand, carrying secrets that would decide the fate of the world. The Germans never knew, but the machine remembers, and so must we.